But after Taverham, what happened then? You've had a variety of jobs, you've had various awards and celebrations given to you. So share some of those stories.
So that again starts with Taverham, because at some point Mrs. Daines sent me a message, could I go and see her? And the story is something like that she advised me that there was a job going in Hull that I should look at. And of course, when that happens, you turn around and you go, what have I done wrong, kind of thing. And her answer was, you've done nothing wrong at all, but I think you have a lot to offer. And I think you should go and offer that in other places rather than just stay here. So I moved from a school with 500 children to a school to a school with almost 500 children in each year group, into Hull Schools reorganisation, Winifred Holtby School, formerly Bransholme High School. And also worth saying that Taverham High School has been the only school that I've worked in that I would describe as reasonably affluent, middle class, if that's the way of putting it. Bransholme High School, Winifred Holtby School, was a very disadvantaged part of the country, and therefore the youngsters were disadvantaged. But we went in with great principles and languages for all, and I had 17 staff, and it was, I think, the largest languages faculty in the country at the time. And we set up exchanges, and if that meant that we needed to subsidise them, we found ways of subsidising them, because there was no reason that those youngsters would not have the same rights as you had, just because they were not as well off. It was harder, it was trickier, there were more barriers, but we did it. There were two things that stand out at that school. One is, we didn't know the name of every child. We barely knew the name of every member of staff. Yeah. And what then happens is that you have the youngsters who are those with severe special educational needs or disabilities, and the youngsters who are very bright are the ones you know, and the ones who are very naughty. And the other 60%, you've got no idea, they become a grey mass. And I decided very quickly that, in a way, that I disagreed with what was going on. It wasn't the school's fault, but what actually happens is, it was the first time I realised that not just in the UK, but globally, we make very few education decisions. We make economic decisions, and the words that were being used around big schools were things like economies of scale, and the word child would be used less and less and less. And despite brilliant colleagues, people who worked incredibly hard, the odds are stacked against you for economic reasons, basically. And that was just not clever. And then the other bit I realised was that the system is unfair in funding terms. And people go, oh, this pupil premium and additional fund. It's never enough. And those youngsters need much more care, many more resources, and more money spending on them, and almost like additional funding for experiences that you and your sister and all the others will have had. So I stayed for 3 years, and very quickly also, really importantly, realised that actually my 17 staff and I had actually never taught most of the children who were in front of us, because what we'd really taught were the top 20%, right? The Taverham High School type child. And I think within weeks was knocking on the door of the head of English, Paul Kelly, a wonderful man, and basically said, look, we're all brilliant linguists, we can teach languages, but we can't teach these kids. I need my staff to come and sit in the back of your classrooms, because you've been doing this for years. So actually the realisation that I might have felt a bit cocky that I was brilliant at German, but actually that teaching children is a thing that requires much more attention and teaching the subject, and that working with colleagues across the piece. I suppose what it was an extension of me admiring Paul Evans and standing outside Richard Taylor's room and putting it into practice. And then also something odd happened, because the national curriculum came in. I'd applied to become chief examiner for Dutch. I got the job, and I think probably because I was the only applicant and the only Dutch teacher in the country or whatever. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, got contacted by the National Curriculum Working Groups for Modern Languages. Would I join that group? Because Dutch was one of the 19 languages on the statutory orders. So you kind of got elevated by fluke, I think.
Yeah.
So I then was approached by Manchester City Council whether I wanted to become the languages advisor. I did. I'd learned the Benjamin Button bit had started at that point, because if you look at education, we were very compartmentalized, right? Primary and secondary, etc. But I kind of realized that many of the issues that we were confronted with, particularly in Hull, the cause of those issues had started much earlier.
Yeah.
So therefore, why wait, right? So the solution has to lie much earlier. So one of the things that I'm incredibly proud of in Manchester was I introduced languages into all the primary schools in Manchester with the support of the consulate.
Wow.
So we did German, French, Spanish, Italian, and Russian, pre the wall coming down, just about. And we had support from those consulates and embassies. We had support from the European Union massively, and we sent hundreds of teachers, primary age teachers, to be trained in Clermont-Ferrand, in Madrid, Alcalá, in Bologna, in Chemnitz, and in St. Petersburg. And it worked. And the other thing we did is we literally linked every one of those primary schools with a school in the country or in the cities. And some, particularly the Italian ones, actually started exchanging, and that's where much later the Shakespeare project came from. And then what happens is time moves on. You begin to think that you should do certain things. So I became an inspector, and I became an Ofsted inspector for a while, the Office for Standards in Education, and I joined the dark side. And it was a very important lesson, actually. I didn't stay for very long. I didn't want to do the inspections anymore, because inspecting should mean a collaborative effort to make things better for the children. It shouldn't mean that you go in, take Polaroid photographs or selfies, I think they're probably called these days, and use them as evidence against to come to one-word judgments that you're either good, bad, or indifferent. I did then become a senior inspector within the local authority. I'd moved to Salford at the time with David Johnson, who was the Deputy Chief Education Officer in Manchester and became Chief Education Officer in Salford. Wonderful man. And I was lucky. The Blair government had come in. There was money in the system. Salford was one of the poorest areas in the country. We got Excellence in Cities money. We did really well with that money because we didn't make the decisions. We literally went to the head. I remember locking a group of secondary heads in a hotel room in Blackburn, I think it was, and literally said, here is the needs analysis. Here is this individual school's needs analysis. Here is the money. This is what it can be spent on. This is the key to this room. I'll be waiting outside until you've sorted it, because it was the only way to do it. And it lived and it worked. And then I got approached by the Secretary of State's office whether I wanted to become the education director for the Education Action Zones, which was a government initiative for the 25 most disadvantaged areas in England. And I got South Manchester, Wythenshawe, where I'd worked before, where the Italian was introduced into the primary schools, and where Manchester Airport was the private sector sponsor. So I literally had an office in Terminal 1 at Manchester Airport, and it was the first time that I saw properly private-public sector partnership, but really importantly regulated. I think private-public sector partnerships are brilliant if they are two things. One is win-win, mostly for the children, and secondly regulated, because we've seen since that when it's unregulated, the finance director becomes more important than the education director, and we're on the wrong track. After a number of years there, I wanted to be out of the system because the teach and test thing had taken over under a by then Conservative government, and I became helped to set up the Children's University, which was all about learning outside the classroom, particularly for disadvantaged youngsters. Yeah. And that then resulted into me going to Kidzania first in the UK with my friend Joel Cadbury, and then later, not long after that, globally. And I think the big lesson for me looking back at that is that there are no straight lines. We teach children that there are straight lines. If you do this, this happens, and if you do this, this happens. And if you are not scared, and if you are reasonably confident in what you do, you will be confident enough to recognize that there are no straight lines, and that you can go to many places, and that you should follow your head, but you should also follow your heart. So from Kidzania onwards then, which became, I was their first education director. We then did lots of global research with universities, and I now advise companies and governments, and I'm in charge of my own inbox. But the main thing was about follow your heart as well as your head, and that's to do with confidence, and that's to do with people who make you confident. I don't think you can make yourself confident. Maybe to a degree you can, but it is the Mrs. Daineses and the Jeff Coolings in Norwich and the David Johnsons and people who trust in you and who go, just go and do it. And if you get it wrong, I'm behind you.
Yeah, I think in the book you talk about role models. We'll talk about role models later on, but it's really evident through your career that there are key experiences and role models that have really shaped what you've done and been able to support.
And I think it's also that recognition, and I would like to think that we need to get children, and you can't teach this from a textbook, but you need to get children to understand that that the role models are there for them, and you need to get every adult, literally every adult on the planet, to understand that there is a very high probability that at some point, even for the shortest period of time, a child looks at you and goes, I quite want to be like him. And that's one hell of a responsibility, but what an honor, right? So mine go from my German teacher to Mrs. Daines to people to this day I meet and think, oh my God, I wish that's amazing, right? And interestingly, incidentally, the role models are not just, because we tend to think that they're always about older people. But I look at you and I think, oh God, I wish I'd had the courage to do certain things that I know you've done. Right? So we need to not do this, we need to do this as well. Yeah.
I think the experiences that you've had and the experiences then that you've given your students and your work colleagues all contribute.
I talk a lot about putting things in your back pocket. I think every experience, good or bad, you should put something in your back pocket, because at some point the time may come when you go, I've got that. I know what to do with that. Or if you don't know what, because that's the other thing, isn't it? Education is not about you being able to do everything. Education is about you being able to seek the solutions. And so that may mean, certainly with me it does, most things I don't know. But I'm pretty good at knowing people who do. And it's about that side of things.
Coming back to Taverham, and coming back to your teaching career, and it wasn't just Taverham as you up in Hull and then Manchester. You talk in your book about your all-time teacher 11. Now, it's a really interesting concept. I am not a football fan, so the relationship to football I'm having to learn, and I can see the connections. Out of the 11 teachers that you've named, I've been lucky enough to know 4 of them. So can you talk a bit about how you came up with the teacher 11, and what I'd be interested in as a teacher myself, if you had those 11 teachers all in the same school, what would it be like?
So I am a football fan, but for football, read rugby or netball or American football or whatever it is, right? It really doesn't matter. The idea is it's about team. And I was very lucky when I was a youngster that the Netherlands were very good at playing football, and that Johan Cruyff was the Ajax Amsterdam star and captain, and also the star and captain of the Netherlands, and then much later became, I think he was voted the most influential person in the game ever. And his autobiography, My Turn, is worth reading from a leadership point of view. Right? So he was a leader, and of course he had long hair, and I wanted to have long hair, and I was, so he was a bit like George Best and the Beatles and all that rolled into one. He was a rebel. He wouldn't shut up. He would stand up for his rights and that of others. So all of those things came into the mix. And at some point, much later in life, when he was manager, he said something like, about talking about best teams, the best team is not about picking the 11 best players for each place, because you end up with 11 brilliant number ones.
Yeah.
The best team is about gelling it and making it work together. So, and as a boy, I used to sit sometimes and write down my favorite team of the week or all that stuff. So I was kind of used to this. So and sitting on long haul flights, I was yet again writing my best ever Dutch team, and I kind of came up with it. And then thought, I literally got thinking about what would that be like if I had my teachers, the people who've taught me, or people I've worked with closely, or the people who I've actually taught with. And then you look at, and it's interesting because it's like the sign on the door, the kind of Willy Wonka thing. So you actually look at who the people are, not just as to what their position is or their shirt number. And it became very obvious to me that there could only be one person who could be the manager of that team, and that's Mrs. Daines. Right? And in my goalkeeper, I wanted to have the head teacher from Winifred Holtby School, Jeff Cooling, not because he was a brilliant leader, because that was Mrs. Daines. Jeff was a brilliant man, an outstanding manager of very difficult circumstances. And I always thought that the goalkeeper has to manage all the other 10 players in front of him. Not lead, but manage. So Jeff went there. And so I ended up with my 11, and they gel. Right? And of course, my number 14, my Johan Cruyff is Paul Nevins. And my number 9 was Mr. Burskins, who was my German teacher, who I became a German teacher because of him. And Richard Taylor was Willem van Hanegem, the brilliant, slightly eccentric number 10. And so you fill that team. And the constant thought I had was, if I take those 11 players and the manager, Mrs. Daines, and I put them into any school, anywhere in the world, would those children be better off for having those 11 people there? And the answer is an unreservedly yes. And there is a mix between the pastoral David Weatherall from Winifred Holtby School, or Leslie Milne from Taverham. There were my own teachers who looked after me, and Mr. Vinken in particular, who knew what was going on at home and kind of put his arms around me, I suppose. So that mix, they are as a team better than they are as 11 individuals, and that's the bit I want. And I urge anybody to try that. It doesn't have to be with teachers. You can do it with work colleagues, right? Yeah. And the only other thing that comes into the play is, there's 2 other things actually that come into the play. The first one is, I know that they would, although some of them don't know each other, they would all have got on. Because of the like-mindedness and like-heartedness. And the other thing is, I would trust them blindly. So it's an interesting exercise, and I'd not thought there are four Taverham High School people in there, and I didn't do reserves because I find reserves offensive, right? Because it kind of implies that you're not quite good enough to make that, and life's not like that. But it was, for me, it was a very interesting exercise, and I look at the list, I think, well, is it right? Have I got it right? And I've changed my footballers list occasionally, but I've never changed my teachers list.
Yeah. So it's a great mental sort of problem to do, and I've done it myself, having read the book, thinking of, if I was rebuilding another team, who would I put in that team? And it's a really good thinking experiment, thought experiment.
It's also very difficult.
Yes, definitely.
I struggled with it at times.
Role models. You talk a lot about key people and significant people in your life, not in your personal life as well as your professional life. And I think it's important to talk a bit about role models and whether they're from your different aspects of your life. I want to talk first about your grandfather, because I think he sounds like an amazing man, and obviously has shaped a lot of who you are today.
So my grandfather was my hero as a child, and partly because he lived just across the railway line. So we lived here in a relatively new house. There was the railway line and a crossing, and he lived there. There was another crossing here, and I'll come to that in a minute. It was an unmanned one. And so quite young, I used to walk on my own to my grandfather's house. You just did. Maybe I was 5, I was 6. And I used to love his company, and he used to love mine. There was a story that, so he was also, I was named after him, right? And apparently he'd said something to my parents that if he isn't named after me, I don't want to see him, kind of thing, right? So I feel, and incidentally, when I used to visit, every time I went back to the Netherlands, visit his grave, it was kind of, I always thought it was slightly odd that my name was on their gravestone, but it also felt really good. So I spent a lot of time with him, and we used to walk with the dog up to the end of the path or the cross, and then walk back. And he used to tell me stories, and I used to stay overnight there sometimes. And he used to tuck me in this bed that I couldn't move, so I just nothing ever moved. Basically, you were tucked in that time. All these really lovely memories. But he made me feel he cared, and I felt that he loved me, and that wasn't elsewhere. So I really felt that he loved me. And I have this, like you have these memories. I have this memory of when I was 9 years old. I was sitting on his knee, and he was wearing his usual corduroy trousers and his cap, and the door behind us was brown, and the chair we were sitting on was blue, and all that stuff. And I can feel the sun on my face. And he said to me at the time, "Promise me you'll always do your best at school." So being 9, you're kind of programmed to go, why? And his answer was, because I don't want you to have hands like mine. He was a coal miner. He was arthritic. His lungs weren't too good either. And I don't know, it struck me at the time as important. So of course I promised. And I think I kept the promise almost all of the time. And what was important about it was that looking back now, it was kind of social mobility personified. Social mobility isn't about percentages of youngsters going to university. Social mobility is with the help of the people around you making tomorrow better than today.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're small steps. So it was incredibly important. And then on the 25th of October 1969, at 20 minutes past 11, he crossed that unmanned railway line, and he got killed by a train. He was also impatient. And I remember he was quite slow, and on the way back from church he would just cross the road, and then people would say, "You can't do that," and his answer always was, "Well, they've got more time than I have." And the train didn't wait, right? So I was devastated. To this day, his birthday is on the 7th of July. He was born in 1891. He had this incredible life of being born in 1891, remembering the first car in the village with somebody walking in front of it with a red flag, to going through 2 world wars, 1 depression, radio and television, loving the television, particularly the figure skating. Sjoukje Dijkstra was the Dutch champion at the time, and he died 6 months after the first man landed on the moon. Whoa, right? And so all of that, and he is with me pretty much to this day, where you think, I don't think there's a day that I haven't kind of thought, just very quickly, or quite in depth, I don't know, what would you have done, old man, about this, And it's a bit like when you get older, you're not there yet, but I find that I'm talking to myself quite a bit, or to the dogs, right? And I talk to him, and particularly when things are sometimes difficult. And so that's never gone away. And he was my first role model. I wanted to be, because what is a role model? A role model says, I want to be like you. That's a role model.
Yeah.
And that can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And at Kidzania, for example, where children come to kind of practice the world of work, I used to say to our staff, who would be the pretense pilot or the pretense engineer or the pretense surgeon, and I used to say to them, when those children come in, you are a surgeon, you are a pilot. Don't let them down, right? You have to understand how important you are in that moment. And that worked.
Yeah.
So, and then there were many other role models, as you say, but Yeah, my granddad was number one.